What comes to mind when you think of the Renaissance? Is it artists like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, the Mona Lisa, Last Supper, and Sistine Chapel? Or perhaps is it Kabbalists like Almelo, Del Megiddo, and Messer Leone? The Renaissance was an incredible moment. It marks a return to the classics, to humanism and naturalism, a rebirth of philosophy, literature, architecture, and art, a cultural, economic, scientific, and political flowering of the human spirit. Although its usefulness and accuracy as a label has come under recent attack, the Renaissance, that great bridge from the Middle Ages to modernity, still conjures an important moment in human history and the history of human thought. It conjures a return to classical learning, to the thinkers and texts of antiquity, after what is felt to be a long period of intellectual stagnation, or at least that's how it's remembered in popular imagination. Central to this entire story, imagined or actual, of the rebirth of the past in 15th century Italy is the rise of one man, none other than the Greek philosopher Plato. In today's episode, we're going to discuss Platonism, Neoplatonism, and Kabbalah during the Renaissance. Hey, what's up, Seekers? Welcome back. Those that have been following this series will know that it is part of a special collaboration here with my co-creators on YouTube, the brilliant, fantastic, and humble scholars Justin Sledge from Esoterica, Angela Puka from Angelus Symposium, Dana Trell from The Modern Hermeticist, and John Vervaeke. This episode in specific is in collaboration with Philip Home from Let's Talk Religion, who is making a partner episode on Neoplatonism and Islam, specifically looking at Sufism and Neoplatonism within the Islamic context. I hope you enjoy all of my collaborators' fantastic, brilliant videos and come out with a wider understanding of the role that Neoplatonism played in the West. I hope you enjoy, and now, onto the episode. We began this series by surveying some theories on the origins of Kabbalah, and in the next episode we moved on to chart the reception of Neoplatonism by the early Kabbalists in 12th and 13th century Provence and Spain. If you thought that things have been crazy up until now, just hold on, because they're about to get really wild. Because the influence of Neoplatonism on the early Kabbalists that we've been discussing only ever remained a relatively peripheral, marginal aspect of their thinking. Besides for some rare instances which we presented, it was never really openly acknowledged outright, and even then, was only presented as quaint parallels to affirm the Kabbalists' own tradition. But Neoplatonism was never reckoned with as a formidable tradition of its own, with its own gravitas and insights worth considering, wrestling with, and reconciling together with Kabbalah. But as we shift our gaze to the Kabbalists working in the Italian Renaissance, the Jewish thinkers at the center of the action of this humanistic revival, we find an entirely new story. One where, for the first time, we see wide-scale attempts to identify patterns of commonality between Kabbalah and Platonism in the attempt to synthesize the two. We see the first time where Kabbalists attempt to claim Plato as one of their own and to interpret Kabbalah through a Platonic and Neoplatonic lens, all predicated on a legend circulating around since antiquity, which was picked up by the Renaissance Kabbalists that Plato and his fellow ancient philosophers had actually studied the secrets of Judaism at the feet of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, making a Kabbalistic reading of Plato and a Neoplatonic reading of Kabbalah only a natural course of action. To properly contextualize and chart the relationship between Kabbalah and Neoplatonism in the Renaissance, we're going to have to go back to Moshe Idell's theory that we mentioned in the very first episode of the rise and fall of Plato's popularity amongst Jewish thinkers in contrast to Aristotle, and looking at its impact on the Kabbalists. We're going to see, just to give a bit of a heads up, that during the Renaissance, Plato and the various pre-Socratic philosophers came to be seen both by Jewish and Christian scholars as part of an ancient wisdom tradition, which included Kabbalah. And Aristotle, who was once seen as the pinnacle of human wisdom by Jewish scholars, was now seen by many of them as an unfaithful, wayward student who had strayed away from the true path of Plato, and therefore from the true wisdom of ages past. Here we go. During the Middle Ages, Aristotle had been all the rage for Jewish, Muslim, and Christian thinkers. Aristotle, personified by thinkers like Maimonides, Ibn Rushd, and Aquinas, had dominated Western religious thought during the Middle Ages in a serious way. So serious, in fact, that many simply referred to him as the philosopher. But as the Renaissance kicked into swing, the tides began to turn. Religious thinkers had begun to grow skeptical of the rationalism of Aristotle. In the Jewish context, which we'll be focusing on for present purposes, that skepticism was directed primarily towards Maimonides and his rational project. Many Jewish thinkers felt that the Maimonidean project of reading just about everything in the Bible as a metaphor and his rationalization of the commandments had taken things just a little too far, and they felt that his project was leading unsuspecting Jews further away rather than closer to God. This antagonism towards Maimonides' rationalism was part and parcel of the growing rejection of Aristotle, the man whom Maimonides quotes more than any other philosopher in his controversial Guide of the Perplexed, his philosophical magnum opus, the man whom Maimonides believed to have reached just shy of prophecy by the power of his own reason, the man that he referred to simply as the philosopher. This man, by the name of Aristotle, had become the new enemy of the pious. But this rejection of Aristotle didn't entail a wholesale rejection of all of Greek philosophy. It rather ironically paved the way for an incredibly warm reception of none other than Aristotle's teacher, Plato. The logic was that while Aristotle was bad news, Plato actually had taught the truth, the same truth in fact as Moses, which is where we get the saying from that Plato was nothing other than Moses speaking Greek. It was only his wicked heretical student Aristotle who had distorted the truth. The result of all of this philosophical drama, the Real Housewives of ancient Greece, was that while Aristotle had dominated the Middle Ages, the Renaissance was now Plato's time to shine. Plato, primarily as filtered through the Neoplatonists, was immensely influential during the Renaissance. In many ways, one could say that the Renaissance was in large part the rebirth of Plato. If the Renaissance was indeed a rebirth of Plato, then one of his most important midwives was a Renaissance philosopher by the name of Marcello Ficino, one of the most influential philosophers of the Italian Renaissance, who was sponsored by Cosimo de' Medici to translate the Platonic, Neoplatonic, and Hermetic corpus from Greek to Latin. Ficino's work, both as a translator, scholar, and the head of the Florentine Academy, an attempt to revive the Academy of Plato, had an immense impact in reviving Plato and Platonism during the Renaissance, with long-lasting ripple effects right into the modern period. Even as the Renaissance had already begun, old-school Jewish intellectuals were still steeped in medieval Aristotelianism, but a change was in the air. Kabbalah was on the rise, and Plato was making his way into the inner circles of the new intellectual elite. The joint dual ascension of Plato and Kabbalah would become a centrally important cultural force in the new emerging Europe. By the time the 15th century came to a close, this new allegiance was seriously challenging the stronghold of the old-school Aristotelian rationalism, picking up both Jewish and Christian philosophical converts in Europe's cultural centers at a rapid pace. In some instances, this transition from Aristotle to Plato takes place in even as quick as one generation, even between a father and son. Judah Messer-Leon and Elijah del Medigo, two Jewish philosophers during the early Renaissance, were staunch Aristotelians, while the very next generation, Judah's own son David Messer-Leon and Judah's student Yochanan Alemano, were already replacing Aristotle with Plato, merging Plato as filtered through Neoplatonism and the Hermeticism of the Italian Renaissance with Kabbalah. David Messer-Leon, Judah's son, a prolific scholar, rabbi, and doctor, writes that Plato is called the divine philosopher, for one who studies his books closely will find there great and tremendous secrets, and all their opinions are those of the masters of true Kabbalah. And Yochanan Alemano, Judah's student, who would go on to become an important 15th century Kabbalist, philosopher, and teacher of Pico della Mirandola, describes Plato as one of the greatest thinkers, and believes that Plato had received his knowledge from the Hebrew prophets. Another fascinating case study in this rejection of Aristotle and adoption of Plato is by another family pair, the late 15th century Elijah del Medico, a ferocious critic of Kabbalah, and his grandson, the 17th century Joseph Solomon del Medico, known as the Yasher of Candia, a staunch defendant of Kabbalah. The one thing that the Aristotelian anti-Kabbalistic senior del Medico and his grandson, the defendant of Kabbalah, could agree upon was the affinity and similarity between Platonism and Kabbalah. The grandfather del Medico writes, "One will find scarcely any difference between the Platonic philosophers and these Kabbalists. They are nearly identical in principles and topics." And his grandson writes that the opinions of Plato are almost the same as those of the sages of Israel, and on some issues, Plato almost seems to speak from the very mouths of the Kabbalists and in their language without any blemish on his lips. The only difference between the grandfather and grandson is that while for the grandfather, the similarity of Kabbalah and Platonism was a reason to reject Kabbalah as a spurious knockoff of Plato, for the grandson, it was a reason to value Kabbalah as a system with philosophical depth of its own worth exploring. The junior del Megiddo, according to his publisher, had himself been, once like his grandfather, a critic of Kabbalah, but upon discovering how closely Kabbalah and Plato resemble one another, he did an about-face and became a staunch ally and defendant of Kabbalah. In his defense of Kabbalah, the junior del Medico would go on to make extensive use of Neoplatonism to explain Kabbalistic ideas, particularly those related to emanationism and the Sefirot, arguing for the similarity of the Neoplatonic and Kabbalistic systems. Writing of the Platonic system, why should we not hold these views since they are ours, inherited by the Greeks from our ancestors, and down to this day great sages hold the views of Plato? We're going to unpack soon what he meant by this, that Plato had inherited these views from our ancestors. But for now, what I'd like to observe is this great irony. The very same realization of the closeness of Plato and Kabbalah was a reason to reject Kabbalah while Aristotle was still hot stuff, but just 2 generations later, when Plato became the thing in vogue, that same realization was a reason to embrace Kabbalah. This rejection of Aristotle and veneration of Plato, and the attempt to merge Plato into the Jewish mystical tradition, is a prevalent theme among many 15th and 16th century Renaissance Kabbalists and philosophers. Far from rejecting this ancient Greek philosopher as something foreign and alien to their tradition, the Renaissance Jewish scholars were eager to find him a way in. Shem Tov ibn Shem Tov, an early 15th century Spanish Kabbalist, in a voice reflecting those of his peers, writes, "The views of the ancient philosophers like Plato seem to be close to the views of the Torah, but those who came later, i.e. Aristotle, did not understand Plato's thinking." Yechiel of Pisa, a 15th century rabbi, scholar, and philanthropist, writes that it can be shown from Plato's own words how close he is to the opinions of the sages. Even Leon de Modena, a 16th century polemicist and critic of Kabbalah, argues that Plato was closer than all his colleagues to the opinions of the Jewish sages, as were his esoteric sayings to their midrashic homilies. The 17th century Kabbalist and philosopher Abraham Cohen de Herrera, who was deeply steeped in Renaissance Platonism and Perennialism, would go on to offer a fascinating Neoplatonic interpretation of Lurianic Sarugian Kabbalah, which, according to some historians, would even go on to play an influential role on the philosophy of Spinoza. Herrera in his writings writes that he only wants to follow the people of the Academy and their master Plato since they are more divine and pious than other philosophers and are also very close to true Hebraic opinions, writes Herrera. And by Hebraic opinions, we can assume he means Kabbalah. And lastly, Menashe ben Yisrael, a 17th century Portuguese rabbi, diplomat, and Kabbalist, talks of the theories of the Kabbalistic theologians with which Plato agreed, and also writes of Plato, whom all his words confirm the view of the Kabbalists, and even goes as far as writing that, behold, Plato's words are the very words of the Kabbalists. With the Renaissance in full swing, Plato is risen to such high esteem that at the peak of his popularity among Jewish scholars and Kabbalists, he even gets called no less than Aplaton ha'Eloki, the divine Plato, mirroring the very same title that Plato had received from their Muslim and Christian brothers, Aflatun Ilahi in Arabic and Divino Platon in Latin. How exactly did Plato, an ancient Greek philosopher living some 2 millennia before the Renaissance, come to know so much of Kabbalah that his words are the very words of the Kabbalists, as Menashe ben Yisrael wrote? How did he get so close to their truth that he almost seems to speak from the very mouths of the Kabbalists without any blemish on his lips, as Yosef Shlomo del Megiddo wrote? One answer might be that if one believes that Kabbalah speaks about the truths of reality, and that those truths are discoverable with enough sincere human effort, then perhaps Plato gleaned the truth of reality in Athens, just as the Kabbalists had in Israel and Spain. But this answer is not the one generally taken and offered by Jewish thinkers in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. They offer some other options. One answer given is that the central texts of Jewish mysticism had been stolen by the Greeks from the Academy of King Solomon in Jerusalem, and that Plato and Aristotle had plagiarized their philosophies from these looted texts. But the more common answer given is that Plato got his philosophy directly from the sages of Israel, during a sojourn in Egypt while he was off traveling eastward for wisdom and knowledge. This legend actually goes back all the way to the Greeks themselves, who believed the ancient Greeks had gotten their wisdom from the East. The romanticization of the Orient has some pretty serious old roots. If Plato had gone off to study in Egypt, some 4 centuries before the turn of the millennia, which Jewish sage might have he encountered there to learn some wisdom from? Well, we know from the book of Jeremiah that the prophet Jeremiah himself, following the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, fled to Egypt to live out the rest of his life there. And thus is born the legend that Plato received his wisdom and maybe even a few mystical secrets from the prophet Jeremiah. This specific formulation of the theory that Plato had studied at the feet of Jeremiah is also a super old one, in fact, older even than the 4th century Christian theologian Augustine, or Augustine, I don't know what the kids are saying these days, who quotes it in his City of God, although he does note that the chronology is a bit off, that Jeremiah would have had to live for quite a long while for this meeting to have worked. But let's not let the facts get in the way of a good story. Augustine's recording of the story makes its way down to medieval Christianity, and from there through people like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Falaquera back to the Kabbalists. And the timing couldn't have been better. Just as Aristotle was on the downvote and Plato was on the rise, we have a tidy little story to explain just how Plato got all of his Kabbalistic knowledge from the prophet Jeremiah down in Egypt, no less. Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, the great 15th century Jewish statesman, philosopher, and Bible commentator, was likely the most authoritative Jewish source responsible for the spread of this legend at the end of the Middle Ages. In his 1501 Deeds of God, Mifalot Elohim, written in Italy following the expulsion from Spain, Abarbanel continues the legend while adjusting it just a little, writing that Plato was a student of the students of the prophet Jeremiah. This student of the students both helps to elevate the profile of the prophet Jeremiah, showing that the great Greek philosopher had a thing or two to learn not just from the prophet himself, but even from his students, and perhaps more importantly, it also helps smooth over some of the chronology issues that might arise if Plato had learnt straight from Jeremiah himself. The story comes full circle, with Yitzchak Abarbanel's own son, Judah Leon Abarbanel, also known as Leon Embryo, Leo the Hebrew, the Renaissance poet, philosopher, and physician, the author of Dialogue di Amore, 3 dialogues of love between 2 characters, Philo and Sophia, love and wisdom, one of the most influential and best-selling philosophical works of the Renaissance. In the junior Abarbanel's dialogues, Plato is depicted as a follower of the Torah of Moses and a student of the ancient Kabbalists. In the Voice of Sophia, representing science, knowledge, and wisdom, Judah writes, I am glad that you are able to reconcile Plato's opinion with that of Moses and the Kabbalists. And with that, the Platonic becomes Mosaic. The transition from Aristotle, the man who was once just shy of prophecy, to Plato, the man who had studied with the prophets, was complete. Those who know a thing or two about Renaissance philosophers will know that they went wild for any ancient wisdom. It was Renaissance philosophers, particularly people like Marcello Ficino and Giovanni Pico del Mirandola, who, depending on whom you ask, either discovered or fabricated a tradition stretching back all the way into the distant past, collecting together philosophers, prophets, and teachers from a variety of religions and wisdom traditions, and tied them together in a grand synthesis which became known as the Prisca Theologia, or later the Philosophia Perennis, the perennial philosophy, an attempt to synthesize and harmonize the wisdom of the Greeks, Egyptians, Persians, Chaldeans, Jews, and Muslims, creating a philosophy that was immensely influential during the Renaissance and still has adherents, albeit in a modernized form, until today. This chain of wisdom teachers who were interpreted by the Renaissance philosophers as sharing the same wisdom and message, these teachers from ages past included people like Zoroaster, Hermes Trismegistus, Pythagoras, Orpheus, and, of course, our main man, Plato. Jewish Renaissance thinkers and Kabbalists got swept into this narrative of shared ancient wisdom by their contemporary Christian thinkers who wanted to rope what they believed to be ancient Kabbalistic sources into their grand historical narrative, merging it with a host of ancient philosophies to create their holy grail, the perennial philosophy, the combination of all of the world's ancient wisdom into one coherent, cohesive philosophy to birth the new human. Kabbalah's combined aura of antiquity and its natural similarities with Platonism made it an irresistible target for this grand synthesis project of perennialism. Christian philosophers like the young Giovanni Pico del Mirandola sought out and found teachers of Kabbalah like Yochanan Alemeno to give him what he needed to construct the synthesis. And in turn, Pico's vision of ancient collective wisdom articulated in his famous 900 Theses, the first printed book incidentally to be universally banned by the Church, and his oration on the dignity of man, which has been called the Manifesto of the Renaissance, both completed, by the way, by the time that Pico was, get this, 23 years old. Both would go on to influence the self-conception of Kabbalah in the minds of Kabbalists like Alemano, Avram Yagel, Abraham Cohen de Herrera, Joseph Solomon del Megiddo, and Menashe ben Yisrael, who started to see Kabbalah as part of a universal shared ancient wisdom, and joined in on this project to reconcile and synthesize Kabbalah with other ancient traditions, specifically with Neoplatonism. Some of these Kabbalists went as far as adopting the entire narrative of Renaissance perennialism whole cloth, taking on the full perennial lineage of ancient sages like Pythagoras, Zoroaster, and Hermes Trismegistus, as well as inserting their own Jewish figures into this ancient mix, or by identifying the classic perennial figures with figures from their own tradition and from the Bible. Barbanel, for example, presents the case that Hermes Trismegistus, Pythagoras, and Plato all shared the correct belief that the soul is created before the body, and goes on to identify Hermes Trismegistus with the biblical character Chanoich, also known as Enoch. And in a much more elaborated version of the story, Gedalia ibn Yahya, in his 16th century Shalshelat HaKabbalah, the Chain of Tradition, presents his own version slapped together from a collection of sources. In his version, Plato studied with Jeremiah. So far, so good. But he then goes on to identify Zoroaster with the biblical Nimrod, the king of Mesopotamia, who Ibn Yahya describes as responsible for inventing the art of magic and the 7 liberal arts: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Socrates, according to Ibn Yahya, also studied with the biblical character Achitophel, the advisor to King David, and with the sons of Korach, the leader of the rebellion against Moses. Pythagoras, according to Ibn Yahya, studied mathematics and the transmigration of the soul, no big deal, with the Jewish scholars of Babylonia. And lastly, Plato, according to Ibn Yahya, quote, followed the way of our Torah in many things, and there is no doubt that he studied it thoroughly. Now that we've given a broad overview of how and why Platonism in its various forms was integrated into the world of 15th and 16th century Kabbalah, let us try and replicate what we did in the previous episode and zoom in on one Kabbalistic theme and see how it relates to a parallel theme in Platonism and Neoplatonism. And like last time, we're going to try and see what the Kabbalists themselves had to say about this comparison. Although one could fruitfully do this with any of the themes that we discussed in last episode, for this exercise today, we're going to be looking at what is arguably the central theme of the Kabbalists, the 10 Sefirot, and compare it with arguably, again, the central metaphysical theme of Plato and Neoplatonism, the theory of the forms and the schema of emanation and return from the one to the many and from the many to the one. Let us begin with an author that we've quoted already, the person responsible for popularizing the legend of Plato studying with Jeremiah in Egypt, Isaac Barbanel. Barbanel, commenting on the nature and structure of creation, writes, of necessity, things exist as a figuration, a tzir, in the mind of the agent before they come into being. Undoubtedly, this image is the world of the Sefirot mentioned by the Kabbalistic sages of true wisdom, who said that the Sefirot are the divine figurations with which the world was created. Thus, they said that the Sefirot are not created, but emanated, and that all of them are united together in God, for they are the figurations of God's loving kindness and God's willing what God created. In truth, concludes Barbanel, Plato also set down the doctrine of separate universal forms, not as Aristotle understood them. Here we see Barbanel comparing the basic Platonic notion of the form or idea that precedes the existence of any individual entity, and of which the individual material entity is a mere imitation and intimation, comparing this with the Kabbalistic notion of the Sefirot as the primordial ideas in the mind of God, the blueprint of creation. These primordial Sefirot, these forms of all future existence, it's worth noticing in Barbanel's description, are united with God and emanate from God, much like the nous, mind or thought, the first emanation from the one in Neoplatonism, is both one with and also in some ways other than the one. Next up on our batting list, we have one of the most famous Renaissance Kabbalists, the teacher of Pico, Yochanan Alamano. Alamano, commenting on the Sefirot, writes, the ancients believed in the existence of 10 spiritual numbers. It seemed that Plato, writes Alamano, thought that there are 10 spiritual numbers of which one may speak, although one may not speak of the first cause, because of its great concealment. However, the numbers approximate its existence so closely that we may call these effects by a name that cannot be ascribed to the movers of corporeal bodies. Indeed, in the opinion of the Kabbalists, continues Alamano, one may say this of the Sefirot. From this it follows that in Plato's view, the first effects are called Sefirot because they may be numbered, unlike the first cause, and therefore he did not call them movers. Without getting too nitty-gritty into medieval and ancient metaphysics here, Alamano compares the Sefirot, harkening back to one of their etymologies of mispar as numbers, with the Platonic causes envisioned also as disembodied numbers by the Neoplatonists, particularly as presented by people like Proclus in the Liber de Causis, and again compares this deliberation so central to any metaphysics of emanation of the question of the identity of the first cause with the first emanation, depicted here as between the first cause and the first numbered emanation both for Plato and the Kabbalists by Alamano. I apologize that we're not unpacking all of these very rich quotations in their full due. That would take far too long. I just want to bring a smattering, a taste of the comparisons that are being made between the Sefirot and the Platonic forms and the Neoplatonic emanations. For those that would like to dig in further, all of the sources will be on screen and in the video description below. Another Italian Kabbalist, Yechiel of Pisa, a younger contemporary of Alamano, writes on similar lines, but believes that while Plato's theory of the forms and Pythagoras' theory of numbers came close to the words of the sages of Israel in their understanding that every lower thing has a superior power and, we might say, model from which it came into existence, and that the lower and corporeal world is in the likeness and image of the upper world, according to Yechiel, they didn't quite apprehend the whole truth. They, in Yechiel's estimation, were missing one crucial component, namely that not only did the divine realm of ideas or numbers affect our reality, but that we down here also have the power and therefore the responsibility to affect the divine realm above, a point which for him bears out the truth of the unity of the cosmos, not only as above, so below, but also as below, so above. Menashe ben Yisrael, who we mentioned earlier as well, the 17th century Portuguese rabbi, diplomat, and publisher, writing in Amsterdam, gives his own twist on this Platonic Kabbalistic dialogue, comparing the Platonic ideas, the plans of the universe which pre-existed in the divine mind, as he puts them, not with the numbers or the Sefirot, but referencing Sefer Yetzirah with the letters of the divine language. Namely, that the Platonic ideas correspond, in Menashe's opinion, to the function of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Even critics of Kabbalah, as we mentioned earlier, drew upon these parallels between Kabbalah and Platonism and Neoplatonism, although their intention was not to praise Kabbalah in that comparison, but rather to disparage it by doing so. On this last subject of the Sefirot, Elijah Del Megiddo, a critic of Kabbalah whom we had the great pleasure of meeting earlier, recapping the position of the Kabbalists, writes, "All exists by the virtue of the power of God the infinite Ein Sof, for the Sefirot are emanated from it and depend upon it. Therefore, in their opinion, the world order is derived from them, i.e. the Sefirot. These opinions," writes Del Megiddo, "were taken from the propositions of the early philosophers, particularly from Plato." Both friend and foe, fan and critic alike, by the end of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, observe and note the striking parallels between Kabbalah and Platonism. What they do with those observations will be up to each of their own dispositions. Some of them will work to creatively synthesize the two traditions, and others will use it as an excuse to reject both. But the existence of these parallels becomes a given. The same parallels that we ever so briefly touched upon here between the Sefirot and the Platonic ideas could be replicated and demonstrated, as we said earlier, with any of the previous themes that we'd mentioned in the earlier episode, the metaphysics of emanation, negative theology, and unio mystica, as Moshe Idel, Adam Oftman, and others have done. But for now, we will suffice with the Sefirot and leave you some good reading material down below. The effects of the Renaissance on Western philosophical thought rippled on for centuries to come. In the case of the Kabbalists, those emerging from the sphere of influence of the Renaissance, some of whom we've already begun to mention and discuss, were markedly different from their non-Renaissance peers. If we can distinguish in broad strokes between the Renaissance Kabbalists emerging from Italy and their non-Renaissance predecessors in Spain and Provence, as well as the mystics of the Zohar and later mystics of the Galilee and North Africa, the Italian Renaissance Kabbalists are far more philosophical in their approach to mysticism, while their peers, if we can draw a wide pattern between them, are much more mythological in their approach. The non-Italians tell the story of mysticism, of a dynamic god and a fallen world, a rich story full of characters and drama, personas and personalities, primordial conflicts, crises, and resolutions. The Italian Renaissance Kabbalists, on the other hand, including some of their predecessors, people like Abulafia, Recanati, and the author of Ma'arechet Elokut, relative to their non-Italian peers, are far more philosophical in their approach to mysticism. They're far more concerned with metaphysical constructs, with questions of logical necessity, cosmological explanations, and conditions of reality, with the unity and simplicity of God, with being and non-being, and the ontological bridges between them, hypostases and gradations of being. Their Kabbalah is an explicitly philosophical project. Another difference between the Italian Kabbalists of the Renaissance and their peers in Spain, North Africa, the Galilee, and elsewhere is a certain cosmopolitan universalism that we find in the Italian Kabbalists, an openness to their non-Jewish other, both in thought and ethic, compared to a relatively far more closed-off particularism, sometimes even giving way to a supremacy and metaphysical racism found in the Kabbalists of Spain, Galilee, and the Zohar. Whereas the non-Italian Kabbalists sought to cultivate a vision of a uniquely Jewish mysticism, free of any external influences, and tended to keep their Kabbalah to themselves as a private affair, their Italian pals were working on adapting their Kabbalah to the dominant cultural influence of the time, finding points of commonality between Kabbalah and Neoplatonism, and sharing what they found with the philosophical world around them. To paint a final difference between the Italian and non-Italian Kabbalists, which we're going to have to paint in uncomfortably large strokes, is their method and practice of mysticism. The Spanish and Galilean Kabbalists were much more interested in the mitzvot as a mystical, metaphysical practice. Their Kabbalah was deeply engaged with halacha, with the rules and roles of classic Jewish practice and life, which were seen as a way to bridge one with the divine, and part of the project was to delve into the ta'amei ha-mitzvot, to the science of understanding the secrets behind the 613 commandments of Judaism, endeavoring to find the hidden mystical meanings lying deep beneath their layers, and seeing them as means to reunite God and to reunite the human with God. Don't get me wrong here, it's not that the Italian Kabbalists weren't interested in doing or understanding the practices of Judaism, far be it from a pious Kabbalist to not be practicing halacha. It just plays far less of a central role for them than it plays for their other non-Italian Kabbalists. Both the Italian Kabbalists' openness to non-Jewish philosophical worlds and their relative devaluation of the centrality of the mitzvah in their Kabbalistic systems might also just explain why the Italian Renaissance Kabbalists never exactly became mainstream in Judaism and remained on the periphery of Jewish intellectual history. This rift between the Spanish and Italian Kabbalists in particular comes to a head in the 1490s, following the Jewish expulsion from Spain, when Kabbalists coming across the continent seeking haven in Italy encountered a form of Kabbalah quite foreign to them. One such Spanish Kabbalist, Yehuda Chayat, writing in Mantua, warns his audience against reading the Kabbalah coming out of Italy, describing it as books that confuse the unsullied mind. It's quite an interesting warning if we can read into it a little. He's almost acknowledging an at least relative philosophical naivety or unsophistication of his audience, unsullied as he calls them, and effectively says, if your faith isn't already bothered by philosophical questions, don't read these works. It's pretty sound advice. Let us bring things to a conclusion. The Italian Kabbalists and philosophers that we've been looking at here today, people like Yochanan Alemano, David Messer-Leon, and Judah Barbanel, both played a pivotal role in the Italian Renaissance, directly influencing and educating some of its key thinkers and movers, but also absorbed influence back from the cultural moments which they were influencing. Influence is a funny thing like that. It's very rarely unidirectional. The Kabbalah that emerges from the Renaissance is remarkably different than the Kabbalah that entered into it, and the Italian Renaissance is remarkably different from the historical moments that precede it, thanks in no small part to its contact with these Kabbalists. It was these unique thinkers positioned at a unique moment in human history that would inspire a way of thinking about Jewish mysticism, one that wasn't at odds with the best learning of their day, a Kabbalah that was not an enemy to the Greek philosophers that had been resurrected and reborn by a generation of Christian and humanistic scholars, one which confirmed the conjured collective wisdom of the past, and which was not afraid to find the Attican Plato to be a Moses speaking Greek. This project of synthesizing Kabbalah and philosophy, mysticism and reason, if you will, born in the Renaissance, would have a vibrant maturation and afterlife in later 16th and 17th century philosophers and Kabbalists, people like Avram Cohen de Herrera, Avram Yagel, Joseph Solomon del Megiddo, and Menashe ben Yisrael. In these thinkers, the project would not merely continue, but would also deepen. If their predecessors during the Renaissance proper opened up the possibility of seeing the very unity between Neoplatonism and Kabbalistic thought, their progenitors, those that continue their path, would go on to create full-blown syntheses, interpreting Kabbalah Neoplatonically and Neoplatonism Kabbalistically, both in what is, in my humble opinion, the underappreciated tradition of Jewish perennialism, which still echoes on until today. This comparative work opened up Kabbalah to external influences, which, some have argued, led to an erasure of its particularity, purging it of anything that was uniquely Jewish about it. But in defense of the Italians and their descendants, this work was done on the assumption, espoused by Barbanel no less and others, that the original teachers of the Greek philosophers were the Hebrew prophets that Plato himself had studied with Jeremiah, and therefore what Plato taught was simply a form of philosophical Kabbalah. It only made sense then to reinterpret Kabbalah during the Renaissance through the lenses of Neoplatonism, seeing as they were originally, in some sense, Hebrew lenses. To conclude and summarize this series, while Neoplatonism plays a small and frankly over-exaggerated role in early Kabbalah of the 12th and 13th century, showing up in a mere handful of the more philosophically oriented thinkers, people like Jacob ben Sheshet and Azriel and Ezra of Gerona, by the time we get to the 15th century, under the influence of the Italian rebirth of Platonism, Kabbalah and Neoplatonism really hit it off, with philosophers like Alemanno, Messer Leon, and Barbanel keen to point out the rich comparisons between the two systems and eager to claim Plato as one of their own. This friendship between Kabbalah and Neoplatonism only continues to blossom into the 16th and 17th century, with Kabbalists like Herrera, Yagel, Del Megiddo, and Ben Israel giving us full-blown Neoplatonic versions of Kabbalah with an unprecedented adoption of the full arsenal of late Platonic thought. And the story which they tell is this. They tell the story of an utterly unknowable God, the one, Ein Sof, which emanates itself into existence via a descending chain of beings, a series of emanations, through a realm of primordial ideas, letters, and forms, each one sequentially further from its source, further from the light, thickening and coarsening until it reaches our material universe, a mere imitation of the divine realm above. But in the process of emanation, a bridge is created which the human soul can reascend and return to its source, back to the unknowable one, to reunite with God, wherein lies its true purpose and its salvation. This magnificent Neoplatonic Kabbalistic story that we've been charting and retelling, an eternal story told in the shape of time, was honed and crafted by the genius Jewish mystics of the Renaissance, together with their Muslim, Christian, and Greek neighbors, lovers of the one, seekers of unity. I hope that you enjoyed encountering the Italian Jewish philosophers and Kabbalists of the Renaissance as much as I have, the men who replaced myth with philosophy, particularism with universalism, and ritual with speculation, becoming even perennialistic mystics, perhaps at the cost of their own Jewishness, or perhaps as a unique expression of their own unique Jewishness. I guess only time will tell. If you would like some hot reading recommendations on the subject, I can recommend checking out one scholar in particular who has written a tremendous amount on this, that is Moshe Idel. In 2007, he wrote a survey of Kabbalah in Italy from 1280 to 1510. The title is Kabbalah in Italy. I'll put it up here on screen. He also wrote a series of essays which we've been using for this series of ours. Among them are the magical and Neoplatonic interpretations of Kabbalah in the Renaissance, which he published in 1983, Jewish Kabbalah and Platonism in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, published in 1992, Kabbalah, Platonism, and Prisca Theologia, the Case of Menashe ben Yisrael, published in 1989, Metamorphosis of a Platonic Theme in Jewish Mysticism, and Italy in Safed in Italy, Towards an Interactive History of 16th Century Kabbalah, published in 2004, and lastly, Particularism and Universalism in Kabbalah, published in 1992. Moshe Dell's work really on this is second to none, and until another researcher comes to try and address the field, it is his words that we will stand upon. Thank you for joining us once again to learn and explore together. Make sure to check out the rest of my wonderful collaborators who are making their own brilliant videos on Neoplatonism and a subject of their expertise, links all in the video description. Thank you to our Patreons who support our work here. If you can afford to, please do consider joining them. It is your kind contributions which allow us to continue to be researching, exploring, and to be creating these content for the public. Each one of these videos takes a lot of careful work, and it is only with your help that we can continue doing it. Thank you for joining us, and as always, keep seeking.